Okay, so so the topic that I would like to bring up here to the Academy is the relevant contribution of the experimental studies to the field of the ice and moons science. And I want to start with this beautiful panel from NASA that probably you've seen elsewhere, which shows how many space missions have been launched to the outer solar system in comparison to the inner solar system. You can see in hot colors the inner solar system missions, and in cold colors those for the outer solar system. So for example, well, maybe it's difficult to see, but you have here the Voyagers and the Pioneers in green, the Galileo in blue, Cassini in pink, and New Horizons in science. So it's missed Dawn and Juno. But what is important from this panel is that it's clear the difference in the number of missions, which you can translate easily to the amount of information we have from the outer solar system bodies comparing, for example, to Mars. Anyway, it's true that these missions reveal a number of fascinating bodies that show exotic activity, geological activity, and even some of them shows evidences to have developed deep environments that could be habitable at present. All these moons are enriched in ices, except Io, so it's the common composition, ices. So to start to study these moons, to start to classify these moons, we can use basic parameters like density and radius, from which we can infer the dominant composition of the bodies. There are some moons with high fraction of rock, like Europa. Some others very tiny, like the satellites of the Saturn or the Uranus systems. Some others that are very large, like Ganymede or Callisto, and others which has intermediate properties. At this side of the diagram, you can see the density of some rocks, like basalts of granite, some ices like CO2 or water ice in the phase 1, or ammonia ice, and liquids like liquid water. So models for of the interior can be produced if you have quantitative information about the candidate materials. For example, the properties of the density of the water ice phases. All the models give us information about the volume of liquid water with the moons, and at the end, information about the habitability potential of these moons. Indeed, from this kind of geophysical approach, we know that the coolest reservoirs of liquid water of the solar system are in the icy moons at present. So at this point, it's clear that we are interested on these ice moons because some of them have the 3 requisites for habitability. Liquid water, as I already mentioned, essential elements for life, and energy available for microorganisms. The problem is that these liquid environments are hidden from the spacecraft remote observation in general. So how can we approach to these inaccessible environments? How this study is performed in Earth? So my 2 cents are for experimental petrology. As you can see, as you can read, experimental petrology involves laboratory synthesis of rocks and fluids for the purpose of ascertaining the physical and chemical conditions under which rock formation occurs. Here, rock is understood as a naturally occurring and current aggregate of one or more minerals, including ices of different composition. So applied to the icy moons, we call this field of research specifically experimental ice petrology. The information from experimental petrology also helps to interpret observations of coming missions to the icy moons. It helps to model the structure, explains the geological activity, and approaches the habitability of icy moons. As you know, coming missions to the icy moons like this will look down to the moon's surface using remote sensing instruments such as radar. We will talk about this later. and this information observations from the interior had to be correlated to the surface information. So the laboratory data is very important to make this correlation. These two figures, sorry about that. These two figures probably are appreciated mostly for geologists who surely recognize the importance that had the proposition of the Bowen series or the discovery of the different magnesium oxides phases to provide understanding about the Earth interior. Similar than the rocks in the Earth, the geological history of the moon's crust is recorded in the ice mixtures, and similar than in the Earth, the geological activity of the moon's crust depends on the physical chemical properties of the materials, mainly the water. In this phase diagram, this is the first one you see, but you will see a lot of phase diagrams, so pay attention to this one, which is the simplest. So here you can see the phase diagram of water, where you see the liquid water here, which is stable at pressure and at temperature. And this is the number. Here is the density of the liquid water. So you can find densities for the rest of the phases. The density of ice 1, this is the normal ice, and the densities of the rest of the higher pressure phases, the ice 2, ice 5, ice 6, ice 7. So planetologists are very interested to know how aqueous liquids and solids evolve, depending on the thermal and pressure gradients. So for example, here you can see different gradients for Ganymede. In blue, you have a cold gradient, and in pink, you have a warmer gradient. So if you have this kind of gradient in Ganymede, for the pressures that you have in Ganymede, you can have an ocean, a liquid ocean, at pressures between 100 megapascals to 1000 megapascals. But if you have this cold gradient, you never will have an ocean in Ganymede. So it's imperative to have and to know this kind of phase diagram to be able to model the internal structures of these icy moons and to know if they are really habitable. Okay, but ice layers are not pure water, or I don't know if somebody thinks about this purity on the geological layers, not me, but you can simplify the chemical systems for modeling purposes, like in the Earth. For example, you can approximate the crust of the Earth to silicates, the mantle to magnesium oxide, as I mentioned before, and the core of the Earth to iron. But really to explain the geodynamics of and the activity of the planet, you need to introduce other compounds and the corresponding phases and quantify their properties and their effect. Okay, so among the interesting compounds to simulate in cryopetrology or ice petrology are salts and volatiles mixed with water, but salts and volatiles are important. These compounds have been detected at different moons and petrologically might act as water antifreezers for the ice. So this happened, for example, in the lakes in Antarctica, where in some ponds you have systems, salty systems, that can reduce the melting point even to -50 degrees. For example, Don Juan Pond in the dry valleys in Antarctica, which has a salinity more than 40%. With this system, sodium chloride, calcium chloride water can maintain liquid the water at -51 degrees Celsius. So these compounds can form different phases in solids and liquid state, involving very interesting thermodynamical changes. You can see here a list of these antifreezers compounds for endogenous fluids proposed by Nouveau et al. With the respective eutectic temperature here of the binary systems with water. For those who are not familiar with the concept of the eutectic is the lowest melting temperature of a chemical system. So remember that, because this term will appear many times during the talk. Okay, so we in the lab usually work with binary or ternary phase diagrams of aqueous systems, I mean with 2 or 3 compounds, which have been refined or adapted to pressures and temperatures of the ice interest. For example, you can see here in this inset the binary phase diagram for magnesium sulfate water. So I explain you a little bit how to read this diagram. You have the concentration of the system in magnesium sulfate and temperature. So this line here means the melting line. So this point, which is the lowest, is the eutectic that I mentioned before. And then this composition here, about 17% weight in magnesium sulfate, is the eutectic composition. Okay, so knowing that, we go back to the main diagram, which is the phase diagram of water, where you have liquid water here and different phases of water, like I showed you before, ice 1, ice 2, ice 3, 5, and 6. And when you put different concentrations of salts, you see that the melting line shifts to lower temperatures. So here you have, for example, for pressure that corresponds to 800 kilometers in Ganymede, for example, which is approximately 1000 megapascal. You will melt the ice 6 at approximately 310 Kelvin. But if you put different concentration of salt, for example, 10% of the magnesium sulfate, you will melt the ice 6 at 290. And if you have the eutectic composition, the 17% in weight of magnesium sulfate, you will melt the ice 6 at about 260 Kelvin. Here below you have a diagram that shows how the density of the magnesium sulfate water system varies according to the pressure and with different concentration. So if you have this kind of systems, of diagrams, and with this other kind of diagrams, you can propose different models for the structure, for example, for Ganymede. In this case, Vance and collaborators propose a multi-ocean structure for Ganymede, where you can have different oceans between different phases of ice, between ice 6 and 5, 5 and 3, 3 and 1. Okay, on the other hand, special interest in planetology have mixtures with volatiles and salts, because they form a mineral named clathray hydrates or gas hydrates, and my favorite ice in the universe. So here you have the phase diagram for CO2 magnesium sulfate water, but we will talk more in detail about this later. Okay, other important compound apart from magnesium sulfate is ammonia, which has been suggested to be present in Titan to maintain the liquids in the ocean, because the melting point of this compound is 100, you have here, 176 Kelvin, minus 97 degrees Celsius. Okay, so there's no time today to revise all the antecedent studies contributing to the ice petrology, but there are some works that I would like to mention, starting from the experiments that were done in the 90s by David Hogenboom and Jeff Cargill and collaborators, who were the first to make experiments with the magnesium sulfate water system, and even they obtained the first data about the densities of this salty system. Other interesting studies to show you are those about the clathray hydrates at different pressures in the binary system of water and CO2 made by our colleagues in the University of Nantes. and those that I mentioned previously by Steve Vance and collaborators about the multi-oceans and the experiments to extract different densities at different concentrations of the salts. Sometimes the experiments are blind, like those made by David Cohen-Boone or Steve Vance, but other times thermophysical data is linked to textural observations, which we know from Earth petrology that are really, really useful. So in our group, we tried to incorporate this kind of data to our investigations. So in the coming slides, I'm going to show you briefly some specific cases we've studied so far concerning stability of minerals at extreme conditions, specifically about the properties and the effects of clathric hydrates in the implications on planetology. Studies about the cryomagnetism in the ice-moons. Some studies about the properties of minerals to interpret data missions. And some studies linked with terrestrial analogs that we think are very promising. But before that, I will present you different equipment that we have available at CAP, including simulation chambers. These chambers are able to perform measurements at planetary conditions with different analytical techniques and sensors, and in some cases these instruments resemble the instruments that will fly in space missions, for example, the infrared or the Raman spectrometers. Experimental petrology applied to ice-moons uses setups to reach normally pressures up to several gigapascals and low temperatures. But there are some other studies that we can do in the lab and are regarding the surface. This is a different seminar, but just to show you the simulation chamber that we use for that kind of experiments. This chamber can reach 10 to the -9 millibars to 1 bar, and temperatures from 40 Kelvin to 350 Kelvin. But focusing on the interiors, one constraint configuring the high pressure setups is that the higher the extreme conditions, the smaller the sample must be. So the devices that are frequently used are diamond sapphire anvil cells, just to work with some drops of samples. And in our case, we use piston cylinders autoclaves, and we can use some dozens of milliliters of samples. I'll show you some pictures of the different equipment that we have. This one here is the one that we had to work up to 30 megapascals. So to work, to go to the Europa's ocean. It's a cylindrical stainless steel chamber that has a sapphire window, and you can do a spectroscopy and visual control through this window. And attached you have different instrumentation. In this case, we have a Raman for spectroscopy and to control the different phases that we have during the experiments. This one here is the chamber that we have, and it works up to 7 100 megapascals. It has 4 different ports for different sensors, and one port has also a sapphire window for spectroscopy. The rest is the same than the other configuration. And the third setup is to go to 1 gigapascal. So we can reach the ocean on Ganymede and the base of the crust of Ganymede. And again, it has different ports, and one of it has a sapphire window for spectroscopy, mainly for spectroscopy. So in all the chambers, we can register automatically the changes in pressure and temperature, that you can see here. With Raman spectroscopy, we can follow the changes in the phases and the chemical changes. And through the window, we can control the shape of the minerals, the anisotropies, the fractures, or crystal morphologies. Okay, so let's start with the study cases. One huge issue that we were studying for more than 15 years is the possible presence of gas hydrates or clathroid hydrates in the icy moon's crusts and the ocean, and the effect of their formation and dissociation on the surface and on the crust of these moons. For those of you who are not familiar with these ices, you can read here, gas hydrates are crystalline compounds that can form when a gas molecule, like carbon dioxide or methane or nitrogen, is surrounded by a cage of water molecules under favorable conditions, mainly low temperatures and elevated pressures. So in some way, they are like field ice. As I said, parameters that control the structure and the formation are temperature, pressure, and gas composition. But in addition, we have to take into consideration the presence of some other compounds, like salts, again, or also alcohols that can bond also with water. So they act as inhibitors of the formation of the clathrates. So clathrates are similar than ice, but some properties are very different. For example, the electrical properties or the thermal conductivity or the density are very different than the properties of the ice in phase 1. And all these 3 properties are very important in planetology because affect the geophysics, and also their uniqueness facilitates the space exploration. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. So we suspect that clathroid hydrates are present in ice moons, like in Europa, in Ganymede, Enceladus, or Titan, because we know that the compounds are there, because we have a spectroscopic information. And we know that the environmental conditions also can form this kind of materials. However, clathric hydrates have not been detected yet. So we don't know why. And maybe this is because they are not at the surface that we've explored by remote sensing techniques so far, or maybe not at detectable amounts, or maybe it's a problem with the instrumentation. I mean, perhaps we are not using the correct instrumentation. Actually, gas hydrates have been proposed to explain, for example, the cryovolcanism of Europa and Enceladus, and also to explain the transportation, the possible transportation of volatiles from the Ganymede interior, or the atmospheric replenishment of methane in the Titan's atmosphere. Okay, so one thing to check in the lab related to gas hydrates was to see how salts affect their stability, because remember that they are inhibitors for their formation. So for example, in the case of Europa, we did this study for CO2 clathrates with magnesium sulfate. In blue, you have the stability field of clathrates. So you have clathrate, you can have clathrates at these pressures and temperatures, but from this line named the dissociation line, you don't have clathrates. Okay, so similar than what we already saw with the water and magnesium sulfate, when you put salt in the system, the dissociation curve shift to lower temperatures. So this is for 5% in weight of magnesium sulfate, and this is for the eutectic composition, which you know already, that is 17% in weight of magnesium sulfate. You can see that for magnesium sulfate, the shift is just 3-4 degrees, but we know that for other salts, for example, chlorides, the shift, the inhibition is about 10 degrees or more, depending on the composition of the chloride. Okay, so some years ago, we calculated the depth at which gas clathrates of different volatiles could be stable in Europa, theoretically. For example, the SO2, the CO2, the H2S, and the methane. And you can see that they can be stable in the crust from a few millimeters and to the bottom of the ocean. So how these features form, sorry, I want to go back. There is something here, because I want to talk about okay, so so theoretically the clathric hydrates are there, but again we have not detected. Anyway, our hypothesis is that you can see the results of the dissociation of these clathric hydrates. Our hypothesis is that they are involved in some geological processes, in the formation of some features like those that you can see here. For example, these rounded features called lenticulae. You see that sometimes these features are related to these red materials and has topographical relief, negative relief, and other times you have these rounded features, but they have a positive relief. Related to the endogenic features, there are some others like these red spots associated with this fracture that has been suggested to be cryoclastic deposits formed by explosive eruptions. So we wanted to know how these features form, how are the mechanisms to form the cryomagmatic fluids, how these cryomagmas evolve. So we try to have answers from the laboratory data. This is a picture from Fagens et al., very recent, in 2022, where you can see a summary of the mechanism of cryomagma, ascent, and eruption that have been proposed for icy satellites, mostly in Europa. But be aware that there are two critical requirements to have cryomagmatism in an icy moon. One is energy to have liquids. Remember the thermal gradients. This energy can be radiogenic or tidal, gravitational, or can be by the impact of bolids. And the second requirement is that the liquids must have positive buoyancy related to the crust. Normally, liquid water has a negative buoyancy in the water. Maybe some of you are drinking a nice coffee now, and so you are aware about this. Okay, therefore, either there are contaminants in the crust to high up the density, or the fluid is enriched in light components like volatiles. Or alternatively, fluids can ascend through fractures by hydraulic pressure. In this regard, we use large chambers for tracking the endogenous processes because they allow us to identify resulting features of thermal evolution of these systems. When working with aqueous salt systems with volatiles, apart from clathrates, we can crystallize salt hydrates with different hydration number. In the case of your friend magnesium sulfate water system, you can have meridianite if you crystallize the phase with 11 molecules of water, or epsomite if you crystallize the magnesium sulfate with 7 molecules of water. But you also can crystallize with 6, with 4, with 1, or you can have also amorphous phases with 3.5, 1.5. Okay, so below here you can see how both binary system, the clathrate hydrate system and the salt system are related in a pressure temperature phase diagram for eutectic composition. So again, this is the dissociation curve So in this part, you have clathrate hydrates, and in this part, you dissociated the clathrate hydrates. This line here, which is the melting line, is this one. And this one that mark the change from 11 molecules of magnesium sulfate with 11 molecules of water to epsomite, to the magnesium sulfate with 7 molecules of water, is here. Okay, so we made some experiments changing the pressure and temperature like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and see what happened. So these are pictures from the set of experiments with this system, magnesium sulfate, CO2, water, with the chamber in horizontal position. And during the experiments, to assess the evolution of the system, we followed the crystallization processes that always started with the formation of clathrate hydrates, as the phase diagram indicates. So at different moments, we observed the formation of layers, layers with different aspects, different features. Always clathrates at the top because the density is lower than the brine. And sometimes the salts at the bottom. We identified features, very interesting features, like blocks or chunks of ices with cavities that appear when the ice degasified. Also, we see some brinicles, these kind of tubes that I will describe later. And also we identified buoyant gassy liquids that rise to the top of the chamber. So also for those who are not familiar with brinicles, they are like stalactites that form under terrestrial polar ices due to different salinity and temperature in different points in the ocean. So this is provoked by the salting out effect, which is also known as the salt-induced crystallization or salt fractionation. And it produces a concentration of the brine, which is denser and has lower freezing point than the surrounding water. So the formation of clathrates accentuates the salting out effect because the CO2 compete savagely against the salt. CO2 and salt want to bond the water, so fight against each other. And when you form the clathrates, you remove the water, so super concentrate the colder brine, and the liquid of the surrounding freeze downward while the brine falls. So interestingly, brinicles have been modeled for the ocean environments at Europa or Enceladus in comparison with the terrestrial ones. And Steve Barnes and collaborators proposed that brinicles are ideal places where ecosystems of organisms might be found because they may concentrate nutrients, for example. Okay, so clathration, I mean the formation of clathrates and the salting out effect emerged in these experiments as mechanisms that produce a very drastic differentiation by crystal fractionation in the salt volatile aqueous system. And as you know, crystal fractionation is a fundamental process that occurs in terrestrial silicate magmas to derive the different rocks that we see in the crust. So we demonstrate with this experiment the fluid density variation change, the measuring by Raman spectroscopy, this variation in sulfate concentration during the cooling and heating experiment. So basically, what we suggest is that the clathrate crystallization produce brine concentration that is followed by salt precipitation, which clearly differentiate the magmatic chambers by density, like in silicate systems. So at the end, if you have a fracture that reach the magmatic chamber, this fracture can depressurize the magmatic chamber and destabilize or dissociate the clathrates and produce an eruption, cryomagnetism at the end. Okay, so linked to this, other interesting moment that we recorded was when the fluid rose to the surface during the heating of the experiment. From this experiment, we checked that cryovolcanism can occur in moons like Europa, more or less explosive, producing cryoclastic deposits or lava flows, depending on the volatile content and the depth at which the cryo magma and the ice crust fragment because the bubbles pressure. So, for example, this spot around Velus Linea can be an example of this cryoclastic deposit on Europa. Other petrological experiments on the same ternary system, the CO2 magnesium sulfate water, were done with the chamber in vertical position here. So this way we investigated the evolution, measuring the features on the top layer. So you can see here, for example, very interesting features like rounded features that appear when the system was cooled to a certain temperature. Okay, so during these experiments, pressure and temperature were also recorded, as we did in earlier ones. They were followed in the phase diagram, while we have a spectral control through the sapphire window. So same procedure than before. What we confirmed from these experiments was that depending on the phases that we formed, the total volume of the system was different. So here you have different composition and the volume change, positive or negative. So the crystallization of clathrates reduced the volume, the total volume of the system, while water ice and hydrates, when crystallized, produce an increase of the total volume. So there is a geological consequence on the surface of having different fractions of clathrates or salt hydrates due to the total volume change associated with the final assemblage or mineral assemblage there will be collapses like this, or positive topography, explaining the different expression that the lenticulae features show in the Galileo images that I mentioned in some slides before. Okay, related experiments to obtain specific material properties. I would like to mention the investigations to obtain electrical properties, because the necessity to integrate future radar data relevant to the penetration depth of RIME and REASON instruments, which are the radar instruments on board JUICE and Europa Clipper missions, respectively. So here you have a picture of a Europa Clipper with both antennas, one that works at 9 megahertz and the other to 60 megahertz. So these missions to the Jupiter system will observe literally the interior of the moons. We know that there are discontinuities in the crust, and of course we want to detect it. So making this kind of measurements will facilitate the interpretation of the future data that we will have. Electrical properties of multi-component systems, even binary systems, are scarce at planetary conditions so far. And although data of these systems already exists at 1 bar and low temperatures, even they are fragmented in terms of sample preparation, temperature and frequency ranges, or component concentration. So we have a lot of work to do in this sense. To illustrate the potential of radar measurements, this is a very recent paper by Culver et al., published in Nature, that explains the formation of double ridges in Europa, like these ones, comparing with similar features in the Northwest Greenland, by analyzing the radargrams of ice sheets. So this is the kind of observation we want to decipher from the mission's data. Other example of how lab data help to interpret the space missions observations is this. Here you can see the results of the static conductivity experiments made by Stillman and Green, 2008, with water ice doped by calcium chloride. They show that it's possible to detect the formation of brine channels above the eutectic temperature, because the contrast in conductivity between the water ice and the calcium chloride hydrates, and the brine that is formed when you reach the eutectic temperature. So the image on the right is from experiments to study the formation of these brine channels in the sea ice, which is very relevant for the ice moons. Okay, for obtaining data at high pressures, we modified our cylindrical chamber in order to incorporate Teflon compartment with some electrodes. You put the sample here between the electrodes to measure the dielectrical properties. So visual control can be done as before with through the sapphire window, and you can make also spectroscopic measurements to control the phases. The sapphire window is important because here you can see the difference of the difference that you have in the aspect of the same sample, but crystallized using different methods. Here you decrease the temperature first, and then pressurize, and then high up again the temperature. But here you pressurize first, then lower the temperature, and then depressurize. So here you can see bigger crystals with more anisotropies. That here that is very homogeneous sample. So the method of crystallization is important. Before to make measurements at high pressures, we run experiments at 1 bar to compare with literature and to have novel data of some of these systems. And we already made this investigation for these systems. When the concentration is not mentioned, means that is at the eutectic composition. So also with the permittivity and the conductivity, we calculate the attenuation of the wave, of the radar wave. So we obtain this kind of figures that shows that these systems, these binary systems with salts are very transparent to the radar wave. So you will be able to see through the crust very, very well with the instruments that will be on board the coming missions to the Jupiter system. Okay, these are some results of the high pressure experiments, which confirm that if clathrates are present in the crust, we will be able also to detect them by radar, because the attenuation of clathrates are different from the attenuation of just water ice. So that's good news. Use an Europa clipper will be able to confirm that there are clathrates in the interior of the giant moons. One last case to mention is regarding lab experiments we are doing for assessing the habitability of the icy moons. We studied the role of clathrates in the biogeochemical cycles. Our hypothesis was that the clathrates formed in the ocean or the crust play a key role in the carbon cycle of the ice moons, because they can be the sink or the source of carbon molecules, such as methane or CO2. In the Earth, in the seafloor, we know that there are cold seeps where hydrocarbons are released, mainly methane, where sometimes clathrates and carbonates are associated. This methane can be biogenic, thermogenic, or abiotic. It has been suggested that some of these carbonates precipitate antigenically from the clathrate phase, and these carbonates are called clathrites. From the habitability point of view, the difference between phases is relevant, because while both phases can retain the carbon molecules, carbonates are permanent sinks in cold environments, but clathrates might dissociate easily, releasing nutrients again to the environment, as we saw before when we talked about cryoorganisms. So we are analyzing natural clathrites from the hydrate-rich offshore of Oregon, including biomarkers, isotopic, molecular, and textural. And now we are simulating in the lab the formation of the clathrites. We are starting from a solution mixing calcium hydroxide and magnesium hydroxide and CO2 in water to form the clathrate first and then dissociate it. I have to mention that these experiments are still running, but okay, I want to show you some preliminary results because they are very interesting. What we are seeing is that calcite is the final phase product when start with calcium hydroxide. But during the experiments of the clathrate formation and dissociation, carbonate structure took diverse polymorphs of calcium carbonate, different from pure calcite or aragonite or baterite. These minerals are normal calcium carbonates, and we are still interpreting the results, but they are extremely interesting, again, showing the salting out effect and the variation of physical-chemical parameters of the aqueous environment during the thermal evolution. So at the figure here at the top is the pressure temperature evolution of the sample during the experiment. At point C, when the pressure dropped, we have the formation of clathrates. At point E, we heat the sample to dissociate them, but they persist up to the point G, and finally dissociate and release the gas. Below you have, maybe you cannot see anything, but they are Raman measurements with different molecular, about the different molecular vibration for carbonates and for the CO2 molecules of the clathrate that indicate the evolution of the phases during the experiment. We're still exploring the planetary implication of clathrites, so maybe I can tell you more about this in future. So I stop here with this work still running, and want to wrap up mentioning, offering you just one remark said by Feynman. That is this one, you can read it. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. So check your investigations. Okay, so thank you very much to all, and a special thanks to the group here at CAP, Maite, Vicky, Laura, Fernando, Alba, Oscar, and Ana. Thank you very much to all of you. And thank you also for the funding projects of the government of Spain. Okay, I stop here.